Alright, so hello everyone and welcome to the London Archives. My name is Rachel and I'm an Archives Officer here in the Engagement and Learning team, which means I do lots of things like this basically. I'm delighted that you can join me today both in person in the room and online. This talk will last around 40 minutes and there will be time for questions at the end, don't you worry. For those of you that are joining online and have any questions, my colleague Zoe is working the live stream, so just pop them in the chat and she'll read them out at the end. Likewise, if there's any sound issues, just let us know in the chat and we'll do our best to sort them out. Same goes for in the room. If you can't hear me at any point, just give me a wave and I will speak up. Okay, can you all hear me okay?
Yes.
Yeah. Glad to hear it. Okay. So, just a bit of background before we get going. Researching Keats has been an interesting experience. I happily admit to not being a Keats expert, so please don't expect any great feats of, in-depth research and new ideas coming to the forefront here. You'd be best off going to Keats' house for that, and you absolutely should, because it's a fantastic place to go to. So I first studied Keats for my A-levels, actually, many moons ago. So I did English literature, we studied Keats, and kind of all I knew about him back then was that he was a doctor, he was born in London, he died of TB, spoilers, and he wrote long, flowery poetry with loads of references to Greek myth in it. I must admit, and this might be risky to a room full of probable Keats fans, I didn't always appreciate his poetry. Probably has something to do with the fact that I've had La Belle Dame Sans Mercy stuck in my head for the last 8 years since I studied it. It won't go away. Don't worry, I will not recite the whole thing for you today. I'm not too sure what's changed, but since I moved to London, my opinion has changed of Keats. I kind of appreciate his story a bit more. I appreciate his poetry a lot more. And when I first moved to London 5 years ago, Keats' house up in Hampstead was kind of the first place in London I visited. It was during COVID, so masks on, but the first place I went to was Keats' house. I never thought I'd be giving a talk on John Keats, but it's funny how life turns out. And just before we begin, I'd like to thank my colleagues at Keats House, especially Rob Shakespeare and Ken Page, for very generously allowing me to use photographs of their documents, which we house here at the London Archives. So, we're going to start a talk about Keats's life, 20 years before Keats is actually born, so do bear with me. The image on the left here is a volume of baptisms for St. Stephen on Coleman Street. So St. Stephen's was situated on the corner of Coleman Street and Gresham Street within the City of London, until it was very sadly destroyed in a blitz in 1940. They just cleared the rubble, they did not rebuild this church. Very thankfully, though, the church records were not destroyed because they'd been deposited in 20 years earlier in a records office. So we're left with, among other records, the parish registers, including this baptism register here. So on the right-hand side of the slide are some of the baptism entries for 1775. It's listing the names of the baptised and their parents' names as well. And highlighted in blue, so it's a bit light, I appreciate, so just this one here, is the entry for one Frances Jennings. So she's the daughter of John and Alice, and Frances is baptised on the 29th of January 1775. And why in God's name are we looking at Frances Jennings? Who is that? We're looking at her because Frances Jennings is the mother of John Keats. John and Alice are Keats's maternal grandparents, and both John and Alice, well, they got married in the same church, so in St. Stephen, Coleman Street, just the previous year in 1774. Sorry, I think it skipped about 5 slides there. Okay, so the map here is part of Hallward's 1799 map of London. Hallward's initial aim with this map was to show every individual personal residence, to number them all basically within London. And for this reason, it's one of the most important maps of the 18th century. It's really the perfect map to, convey the London in which Keats lived. It's contemporary to Keats, so he's alive at this time. And it really allows us to narrow down where Keats was living in London. You'll notice that the map has been edited, so that was by me. And this section of the map is focused on Moorgate and Moorfields within the City of London. The actual Moorgate, so the gate to the City of London, had been demolished in about 1761, 1762. But it's still a very busy entrance to the City of London at this time. You'll notice the highlighted section of the map, with the highlighted buildings being across from Moorfields and Bethlem Hospital, which is just here. And I've highlighted these buildings because this is where John Jennings, so Keats's maternal grandfather, leases the livery stables of the Swan and Hoop. So that's in red where the livery stables would have been. And then the blue dot there represents number 24, the pavement, and this is where they're living at the time. So right next door to livery stables is number 24, the pavement, and that's where Keats's grandparents and Keats's mother live. Whilst no images of the original building survives, the site is now occupied by the Globe pub, and Keats on the go, like Keats at the Globe. I've never been to that pub. I don't know if any of you could recommend it. No. Speak to me after. No, not worth it. Not worth the trip, apparently. Sadly, maybe I'll still try. We do have still a fairly good idea of the scale of the business, thanks to surviving records. It was quite a substantial business that they're running. So, speaking of the records, this volume here is part of the collections of the Sun Fire Office. So it's a fire insurance policy. Fire was a massive hazard back in Keats's times because most things are made of wood. So if there's a spark in your premises, your whole business could go, your whole livelihood could be up in flames. So it's very important for them to insure their business premises and personal homes. The register here, number 327, is for the year 1785, and we're looking at policy number 500699. These registers are an incredible resource if you've never seen them before. They're one of our most popular collections at the London Archives to have a look at. They include information on the date the policy is taken out. They give the name of the person who is taking the policy out, their occupation, their addresses, and it will also give a brief description of the property being insured and the premium they've paid for it. And it's this brief description of the property that's the most interesting part, because you're kind of getting details that you're not going to find surviving anywhere else. So this particular entry that you're seeing here is for one John Jennings. Next, the Swan and Hoop at Moorgate, Moorfields. His occupation is given as stable keeper, and Jennings is insuring his dwelling house and his coach house, as well as the contents of the properties. From this entry, we learn that they possess stables and lofts over them, adjoining each other in the yard. They have separate stables in the yard, built of brick and timber. And they also have number 22 on the pavement, which at the time this policy is being written out, is currently under construction. And it's also said that they own 2 houses in Bun Hill Row, which is leased out to 2 occupants. So they're landlords as well. And then the premium at the bottom right, you might be able to make it out down there, comes to a total of £2,300. So these are quite substantial holdings, and the family is quite well off. Yeah, not bad. Wouldn't mind it myself. So they're doing very good business at the entrance of the City of London. They're adjoining an inn where travellers could rest, and they could rest their horses in the livery stables, kind of exchange them if they're going on their onward journey. And they're doing so well that by 1794, that they've employed an ostler, so someone to look after the horses. This person is also managing the stables, and this man just so happens to be a Mr. Thomas Keats. So it's John Keats's father. So this is where Thomas Keats meets the boss's daughter, Frances Jennings, and the two really seem to hit it off. So much so that in, again, 1794, so the year he starts working there, Frances and Thomas end up marrying. So Frances has married her father's employee. Frances and Thomas marry at the very fashionable St. George's in Hanover Square, which is pictured here. If you've ever read a book set in the Regency period, then you'll know that this is the church to get married to if you're anyone. It's super fashionable. If you're not getting married here, what are you doing? There's speculation that this was a rushed marriage. So this is evidenced by the fact that there were no family witnesses to the marriage. You'll find it written in some places that Francis had a reckless impetuosity. Bit harsh, I think. It's hard to know what to believe, especially when you see that Thomas is described as a man of common sense and respectability. So when you compare the two descriptions, I don't know, to me it looks a bit, dare I say, sexist. A bit harsh on old Francis there. Especially when you consider the fact that they're both very young. Thomas was 20, Francis was 19, and we are relying on very vague descriptions of the Keats family. So we're not too sure what we should believe when it comes to them. Even if Alice and John Jennings weren't too happy about their daughter's marriage, they do appear to have accepted it pretty quickly. So what we have here is another insurance policy. This time it's from the 9th of February 1803, which you can see just written at the top there. And the policyholder this time is Thomas Keats. So what we learn from this register is that John Keats's parents have taken over the running of the Swan and Hoop livery stables from the Jenningses. Alice and John are said to have retired in 1802, so the year prior to this policy, and passed the reins, no pun intended, of the running of the stables to their daughter and her husband. Thomas, in this policy, is now listed as the stable keeper, which is how his father-in-law was described in the previous register we saw. One thing that is a bit different on this policy is that printed books are specifically listed as being covered. This might suggest that they have quite the literary collection. If it warrants a mention, an individual mention in the policy, it does sound to me like they have quite a few books in their house. The premium paid on household goods, wearing apparel, printed books, and plate therein comes to £225. And if you account for inflation, this would be worth around 20 grand today. That's according to the Bank of England website. Don't quote me on it. So what we have by the time of Keats's birth in 1795 is his parents working at the livery stables. So Keats is about 7 years old when his grandparents retire and pass the running of the business over to his parents. They're in a very decent financial position. They don't really have to worry about money at this time. The business was very competently run by John and Alice, and they seem to have passed their business know-how onto Thomas and Francis Keats. So there's a lot that have been written about, like working class John Keats. I don't think that's particularly accurate. He's doing quite well at this time. There are money troubles to come ahead for him because he's not too sure about how much he's inherited, and his guardians, when his parents die, aren't really telling him the whole story of how much money he has. But I think it's probably unfair to call him a working class poet in his future. Moving on to the man himself, John Keats. This painting here shows the church of St. Botolph without Bishopsgate, as it looked in 1815. So it's contemporary to Keats. That being said, it hasn't really changed much in the intervening years from the outside. Unlike St. Stephen's on Coleman Street, this church survived the war. It only had minor bomb damage. And it's still open today. If you want to visit, you can visit the actual font in which Keats was baptised. It's still the same font. So again, this painting is contemporary to Keats' life in London. And the records of the church are where we first see John Keats appear in the archive. So this here is one of the parish registers for St. Botolph's in Bishopsgate. And this particular register is for baptisms and burials, as you can see it here, from 1780 to 1802. So it's been rebound at some point, this volume. And this is Keats's baptism record. And it gives his parents' names as well as his date of birth, which here is given as October 31st, 1795. John Keats's record is just shown by that red arrow there. It's thought, though not known, that he was born at home in the Swan and Hoop. We're kind of assuming that. There's no actual records to say he was born there, but it's very, very likely he was. Keats's parents would return to St Botolph's in June 1803 for the baptism of John's sister and his parents' youngest child, Fanny. So John Keats, when it comes to religion, he's not what you would call an enthusiastic churchgoer. He seems to have shied away from formal Christianity. He's kind of more of a nonconformist than he is a strict Anglican. So this is kind of, you can see this in some of his letters as well. So in a November 1817 letter to his good friend Benjamin Bailey, who at the time Benjamin was studying theology at Oxford, Keats kind of discusses religion and declares that I'm certain of nothing but of the holiness of the heart's affections and the truth of the imagination. He's quite the dreamer, is Keats. He's got away with words. So John was the eldest of 5 children, of which 4 survived infancy. The surviving siblings were George, Thomas, and Francis, who went by Fanny, which is good because it'll get very confusing because a lot of these people in this talk have the same names. Another brother, Edward, sadly died in 1802 at the age of just 1. Thomas, or Tom, as he was known, so Keats, John's brother, sadly died young again at the age of 19 of consumption, or tuberculosis as we'd call it now. And when Keats was to compound tragedy after tragedy, it's a very unlucky family, I'd say. When Keats is 8 years old and away at school with his brother George, their father, after visiting them at their school, is returning home, and Thomas is involved in, despite his talent with horses, a fatal horse riding incident. So he basically falls with his horse and he fractures his skull and dies a few hours later. It's a very grim tale. And that's on the 15th of April, 1804. Keats is just 8 years old. Frances, their mother, does not take the loss well and remarries hastily just 2 months later. So maybe the reckless impetuosity might have some merit. We won't judge her too harshly. So the Keats siblings, because Frances isn't coping very well, go and live with their grandmother, Alice, in Enfield, and eventually move to Church Street in Edmonton. Frances, Keats's mother, again, another one that dies from consumption in 1810 at the age of only 35. TB plagued the Keats family. It can be seen as the family ailment. Nearly all of the family members are affected by it. It must have been very difficult watching members of your family waste away. It's an extremely harsh disease. You suffer greatly from it, and it must have greatly affected John and his siblings to watch that happen. John's grandmother, Alice, dies in 1814, and around this time we see evidence of Keats's first attempts at poetry. The poem on the right here is As From the Darkening Gloom a Silent Dove, which is written in response to the death of his grandmother as kind of his way of coping with it. Compared to his later work, his style here is much simpler. No Greek myth referenced here, thank God. And the imagery is quite clear. Very famously, Keats trained in medicine. His first experience in it was as an apprentice for 5 years to Mr. Thomas Hammond of Edmonton, who was an apothecary. Hammond had a premises on Church Street, which is where I said Keats moved with his siblings to live with Alice, the grandmother, on Church Street in Edmonton. So this Thomas Hammond was known to them. He'd be their family doctor, basically. So this document here is a facsimile, so it's a copy, of John Keats's certificate of practice as an apothecary. It showed he completed his apprenticeship, which lasted 5 years. It shows the number of lectures he'd attended, so 2 courses on anatomy and physiology, 2 theory and practice of medicine, etc. And it also shows his hospital attendance at the bottom, which we will go on to in a second. And it was issued on the 25th of July, 1816. So in October 1815, Keats registered to study medicine at Guy's Hospital, because he had to do that to get his apothecary certificate, basically. He would have also worked at St Thomas's because they were a united hospital at the time, so it would have probably been between the two of them. So he needed to do this, register to study at Guy's in addition to his apprenticeship, to gain the licence to practice as an apothecary, which you saw in the previous slide. So in addition to the training, he would have to have passed 4 final exams to gain the certificate. He actually passed first time, which was unusual. Most people actually who did their exams with him failed, so he's done quite well. And the certificate that you saw only allowed Keats to practice in the country, so i.e. not in the City of London or 10 miles around it. So he could not have practiced in Edmonton, where he lived. He'd have to go further afield if he wanted to work as an apothecary. These here are quite special. These are the pages from John Keats's notebook he used as a medical student. So this is Keats's handwriting right here. And it's dated to 1816. On these pages and these days he's studying, Keats was noting down basic biology of the human body. He's basically doing anatomy classes. On the left, just here, he's writing about bones, and on the right, he's writing about the structure of the heart. It's all pretty basic anatomy that you would kind of need to know to do the job. So the top left entries are just up there. Reads, the bones of the hand are divided into 3 parts, carpus, metacarpus, and phalange, making a total of 27 bones. So, it's not quite up to the standards of today for their medical practitioners. But he needs to know all this if he's to qualify as a surgeon. So whilst Keats doesn't always come across as the most attentive student in the world, his fellow student Henry Stevens, in his Memories of Keats, he writes that basically in the lecture room he seemed to sit apart and be absorbed in something else, as if the subject suggested thoughts to him which were not practically connected with it. He was often in the subject and out of it in a dreamy way, so a very long-winded way of saying he was daydreaming. And an activity that every school child and student is very familiar with, and you can see on Keats's notebook, is he was a massive doodler. So he's drawn all these flowers rather than be listening to the lecture that's being given, which is fair enough. I think we all do that sometimes. We might be doing it right now. Please no. So I don't think we should dismiss Keats's abilities as a medical practitioner at all. Because in March 1816, Keats is registered as a dresser at Guy's Hospital, which is very, very early in his studies to be doing that kind of role. As a dresser, he was assigned to the surgeon William Lucas Jr., who was infamous for being heavy-handed in his surgery. I'll leave you to imagine what that might look like. And it would have been Keats's job, among other things, to dress the wounds post-surgery. You need quite a strong stomach to get through an early 19th century surgery. So Keats is doing quite well. And despite showing promise, Keats never completed his training. He dropped out in 1817, and as we'll see though, his medical training will follow him throughout his career as a poet. But why did Keats drop out of the medical training? Perhaps we can assign some of the blame to this man right here, looking very dapper in these illustrations. This man here is Leigh Hunt. Hunt was a poet, a critic, a journalist, and an editor, to name but a few of his roles. He was a man of all trades, and master of all of them, I'd say. More importantly, Hunt is at the centre of a literary network. He knows literally everyone in literature worth knowing. So if you know Leigh Hunt, you know everyone famous at the time, basically. Hunt is editor of radical, free-thinking magazine, The Examiner, which Keats first starts reading around 1810, so when Keats is about 15, he starts very early. He idolises this man, Hunt, and Leigh Hunt actually gets arrested and imprisoned for 2 years for libelling the Prince Regent. Fair play to him. And I say that perhaps we have Hunt partially to blame for Keats's abandoning his medical training, because on the 15th of May 1816, one of Keats's poems is published for the first time. You may, just about, be able to make out in the bottom right-hand corner of the slide the newspaper page with the poem titled To Solitude. The poem is published by Hunt in the Examiner, and that's a sure way to earn Keats's love. He gets a taste of fame, he gets a taste of his poetry being acknowledged and appreciated, and he's basically caught the poetry bug, and he is hooked. And if we look at the date, so this is 1816, this is during and around the time of his medical training. So his focus has never solely been on medicine. Poetry has kind of been a through line in his life, and he's gradually leaning more towards it, despite medicine probably being a safer career choice. I don't think my parents would be too happy if I just quit my job and thought, you know what, I think I'll write poetry instead. But maybe I don't have Keats's talent. Keats eventually meets Leigh Hunt in person. He goes to visit at Hunt's cottage up in Hampstead, which is pictured here. This is Leigh Hunt's cottage. And Hampstead is very much rural at the time. Keats is introduced to Hunt through an old school friend of his, and he's very, very excited and even writes a poem about the prospect of meeting Hunt. Super eager guy. And I think this is really what cemented Keats's decision to quit medicine and pursue poetry full time. It's this meeting with Leigh Hunt. This connection to a man who is followed for over a decade. Hunt shows a great interest in Keats and supports his work. And he kind of recognises his potential, there might not be many people back then who were recognising his poetry in that way. So Hunt and Keats become friends, they support each other. Hunt is very supportive of Keats's publications, and they keep up not only a correspondence, but they meet up regularly. So this is an original letter, so this is a photocopy there, that's the original letter over there in that little frame. And this letter was sent by Leigh Hunt to John Keats. And the first line of this letter is, "I shall see you this afternoon, and most probably every day." So they're quite close. I think that would be a bit much for me, but they seem to get on quite well. And this is the reverse of the same letter. You'll see Leigh Hunt's signature on the left there, and Keats's address is just on the right. So at this point, this is a bit later on, so Keats is already living in Hampstead at this time, which we'll get onto later. You'll also see in the bottom right-hand corner, that's Leigh Hunt's seal to close the letter. So through Hunt, who was at the centre of this, impressive literary circle, Keats is introduced to some of the big names of the 19th century. And apart from, John Reynolds and artist Benjamin Haydon, who Keats absolutely loves, he's very excited when he meets them. Keats also becomes acquainted with the likes of the Shelleys. So this letter here is very special because it's written by the author of Frankenstein, Mary Shelley. It's addressed to my dear Hunt. So the networking that Hunt has done is incredible. He'd do very well in the corporate world today. So this letter was sent to us sometime in the 1800s. We're not too sure on the date, there's no date on it. And it's quite a long letter. And Mary and Hunt clearly had quite a good relationship. Unfortunately, Keats and the Shelleys, while they did know each other, they were never close. They never seemed to quite click. So they're kind of more acquaintances than friends, those. And Mary writes, if you're struggling to read this, don't worry. She writes in a bit of a scrawl. You'd think she'd have better handwriting for an author, but maybe she's in a hurry. So it can be quite hard to work out what she's writing at first glance. And here on the right, you can make out Mary Shelley's signature. So despite all of these literary collections and all of the praise they get for their work, Leigh Hunt and his friends were viciously attacked in the press. John Keats in particular was subject to attacks on his poetry and on himself. The worst culprit for this was Blackwood's Edinburgh magazine, particularly John Gibson Lockhart, who wrote for them. Lockhart appears to have taken great joy in bullying John Keats through his critiques. On Keats's release of the poem Endymion in 1818, it's reduced by Lockwood to imperturbable, drivelling idiocy of Endymion, which is ridiculous when we look back now. We all like that poem, mostly. So having it reduced to that, I mean, it would have been awful to put all that work into something, expect praise and just get absolutely torn apart by one man in the press. And sadly, the vitriol is also against Keats himself, not just his poetry. They attack his background, his education, and latch onto his previous training and career in medicine. They make constant jabs that he should stick with medicine as the quality of his poetry is so bad. And I directly quote here, "It is a better and a wiser thing to be a starved apothecary than a starved poet. So back to the shop, Mr. John, back to plasters, pills and ointment boxes." Which is, he was really going for him, this guy. Absolutely hated his work, did not like John Keats at all, and made it very much publicly known. So that is published in a national newspaper. Blackwood's magazine is the first to adopt the moniker the Cockney School to describe Hunt's group, including Keats, because most of them are from London, basically. If we look back on Solitude, so that poem that was first published in the Examiner, we get the impression that Keats isn't particularly enchanted with life in the capital. He doesn't particularly like living in London. So one of the lines from that poem is, "Let it not be among the jumbled heap of murky buildings," which I'd say was probably a pretty direct reference to London there. He might have a point. So he must have found this moniker, particularly vexing. And having his work pulled apart in such a fashion must have been devastating for Keats. All he wanted was for someone to read his poetry and like it. And whilst, of course, there's lots of people that do, the most vocal ones are always the people that don't like what you're doing. Moving on to happier notes. Maybe not. I'm happy for 5 minutes and then sad for the rest of the time, I'm afraid. Every good story, in my opinion, needs a good romance. Keats doesn't really disappoint here. In December 1818, Keats's brother Tom dies from consumption, and Keats had been living with him and had been caring for him, as had his other brother George, but George then moved to the States, to America. So Keats, after the death of Tom, moves up to Hampstead to live with his friend Charles Brawne. The house at the time was known as Wentworth Place. We now know it as Keats' house, which you can visit. So the Dilke family, who Keats was also friends with too, lived on the other side of the house. So what you have at Keats' house is basically the house split in two. In one half is the Dilke family, in the other half is Charles Brawne and John Keats. And it's here, at Wentworth Place, that Keats meets his love, Fanny Brawne, for the first time, and she lives in Hampstead, which is how they meet. And this is how Keats describes her initially, and I quote, this is going to be a bit harsh, "She is about my height," which isn't very tall, he's around 5 foot tall, "and a fine style of countenance of the lengthened sort. She wants sentiment in every feature. She manages to make her hair look well. Her nostrils are fine, though a little painful. Her mouth is bad and good. Her profile is better than her full face, which indeed is not full, but pale and thin, without showing any bone. Her shape is very graceful, and so are her movements. Her arms are good, her hands baddish. Her feet, tolerable. She is not 17, but she is ignorant, monstrous in her behaviour, flying out in all directions, calling people such names that I was forced lately to make use of the term minx." So a bit damning there for the love of your life. Definitely doesn't appear to be love at first sight there. Oh, I hope not, because I think if I was described like that, I would not be happy. But we'll perhaps forgive his little tirade on Fanny Brawne there, seeing as he just lost his brother, although I think some of that's pretty unforgivable. It's also during 1818 that Keats's health starts to decline. He starts to have problems with his throat. He has repeated bad throats, like sore throats, and he occasionally develops fevers. It's not all out, consumption at this time, but it's heading that way. So in April 1819, the Wilkses, who were originally living in that one half of Wentworth Place, decide to move, and doing that, they lease out their half of the building to the Brawnes. So this puts Fanny and John in very close proximity to one another, and it's likely this that was the catalyst for their eventual romance. And it's during this time when they're kind of living, well, essentially together, that he's writing La Belle Dame sans Merci, Ode to a Nightingale, Ode to a Grecian Urn. So with Fanny as his inspiration, he's writing some of his best known works. It's all looking well for him. This letter here, from John Keats to Fanny Brawne, so it's a love letter, and it does evidence their love. It was actually purchased by the City of London in 2011 to go on display in Keats' house up in Hampstead, so you could go see it up there. And it actually cost £96,000. So I hope you enjoy it and get your money's worth. Keats wrote this letter at home in Hampstead, so it's nice that the city brought it and kind of reunited it to where it was originally written. It was written in 1820. By this time, he was very ill with consumption. Through the letter, you can kind of feel how desperately sad he is to be separated Fanny due to the illness. It's dramatic, it's romantic, and Keats kind of expresses his sadness here. He's saying things like, "I shall kiss your name and mine where your lips have been, lips. Why should a poor prisoner as I am talk about such things?" So because consumption is very highly contagious, they've had to be separated, and he's lamenting the inability for them to share a kiss and do like the most basic couple things, basically. And this is just the second half of the letter here. You can see it's signed by J.K. down there, so John Keats. With Keats's medical background and having watched many of his family members die from the same illness, Keats would have known exactly what was going to happen to him. He knew exactly what agonies awaited him due to the illness's symptoms, and it must have been very, very scary, especially when, like, he's a poetic genius, basically, and he has all these ideas, and he just knows that he's never going to be able to express them all because he's going to die fairly soon. And he signs the letter here, "Ever yours affectionately, my dearest." So he writes very beautifully to her in his letter. He's definitely made up for all the stuff he said about her to his brother George in that letter. So in late 1819, Keats and Fanny get engaged. Keats gives Fanny this exact ring. It's a garnet set in gold, and he must have had at least maybe some hope to become engaged, some hope that maybe a miracle will happen and everything will be fine. But they don't make the engagement public, so they keep it kind of between themselves. Sadly though, in 1820 he sees a great decline in his health. He has hemorrhages and sees the illness as a barrier to his being with Fanny, so he even considers breaking off the engagement. He realises at this point that it's a terminal illness, he is not going to survive. And kind of to alleviate his symptoms, he then, decides he needs to leave London. And he decides to go to Italy, because it's a warmer climate, it's a drier climate, it'd be better for his lungs, basically. So he leaves London and England, and he is never to return to England or Fanny again. Keats dies in Italy on the 23rd of February, 1821, at the age of only 25. He was buried in the non-Catholic cemetery just outside of Rome. TB had killed him, his mother, his brother Tom, possibly some of his extended family too, and it would eventually kill his other brother George as well. So basically it's a family decimated by tuberculosis. His headstone in Rome reads, "This grave contains all that was mortal, of a young English poet who, on his deathbed, in the bitterness of his heart, at the malicious power of his enemies, desired these words to be engraven on his tombstone. Here lies one whose name was writ in water." So he's kind of echoing the criticism of his work he faced during his life. He's quite bitter about it at the end. And this is Keats' house / Wentworth Place, as it looks today. It's very beautifully kept. They have a team of volunteer gardeners over there that keep it all pristine. And Keats' house is now a museum, open to the public, and as I've said multiple times, well worth a visit. You can see some of the original letters, so some of the stuff I've shown you today. You can see it on display at the Keats' house. You can see some of his original poetry as well, written in his own hand, when he's trying to figure out what the poem's going to sound like. You can also see the rooms in which he, Fanny Brawne, and his friends lived. And this year is particularly special because it marks the 100th anniversary of Keats' house opening to the public. So do make the trip up to Hampstead and have a look yourselves. So we've got the Northern Line just up at Angel. Hop on after this, have a visit. Highly recommend it. But thank you for listening. And are there any questions? Don't all ask at once. Yeah, go for it.
I'm interested to know whether he actually assisted in the operations. You told us that he was a dresser, helping people after their operations were over. But did he actually attend the surgery?
Say that is likely yes. He'd probably be in there, like soaking up. This is a bit grim. Soaking up the blood as he's like create like a visual field for the surgeon. Basically, he probably would be in the room. Yeah. I mean, I doubt he'd be doing any of like the intense surgery, but he could lance the boil or something like that. He'd be doing that kind of thing. But with bigger surgeries, he'd be in there with the actual surgeon that he's kind of been assigned to help him out.
And is an apothecary a full-scale doctor?
So it gets a bit complicated. So basically, I think what we would call a GP now is something called an apothecary surgeon. And then the surgeons are doing the actual surgery, and then the apothecary would kind of be like, they would again lance the boils, make the pills, make the medicine, do like the basic stuff like that. But yes, you should really check out the Society of Apothecaries if you're interested in that kind of thing. They're really the people to go to. They've got all the records of the apothecaries basically in their own archive. Yeah, go for it.
In relation to his contemporaries, his other poets, was he seen as a radical writer or just a good version of what everybody else did?
Well, interesting. I don't think he was particularly, I mean, this might be a controversial take, do correct me if I'm wrong. I don't think he's particularly radical in comparison to the others. Shelley's a mad lad, he's quite radical himself. So compared to some of the others, he's probably quite tame in what he's writing. But I suppose when he's being viewed as working class, I suppose it is quite radical for this guy to come along and start spouting Greek myth and all this kind of thing, and sounded quite clever. And I think it must have really annoyed some of the people that saw themselves as above him, probably some sort of upstart Cockney boy coming and trying to do poetry. I think that's probably a bit radical for them, but in our terms, probably not so much. Yeah.
So how did Fanny's life play out after Keats's death?
Yes, so she does not die of consumption. Mark, the only one that doesn't, it looks like. This is Fanny Brawne, yeah, not the sister.
No, the wife.
Yeah, the one. Yeah. So she does get married to someone else, and she lives until I think 1865. So she has a long life. The ring she gives to someone else, so she keeps it for a while, passes it on, and it eventually passes to Keats' house up in Hampstead. So she lives her life as well as she can after losing John Keats. I think she actually got. I think there was some stuff written about her when she was alive, and I think she got dragged a bit for it. I don't think people were particularly nice to her after John Keats died about her relationship with John Keats. Any more? Yeah, go for it.
I'd ask what I think was shown on that lovely map as Little Moor is now, I think, Keats' Place between the two Moorgate exits.
Yes, okay.
And there's a lovely mask of Keats there, which is on a plinth. Do you know, is that a death mask?
Well, I'm not sure what's that. I know that there is definitely a life mask of John Keats. That definitely exists, and you'll see it in all sorts of places. I think they probably have it at Keats Museum, Keats House as well. So it might have been his life mask, that one actually. That's kind of the more famous one. I'm not sure if there is a death one.
I think the dining room is called the Keats as well.
Oh.
In the Globe Park, yes.
Yeah, it is. Yeah.
I'm going to have to go now.
I think there's a death mask. We happened to go to Keats' house in in Rome,
Oh,
and I think there's both a life mass and a death mass, as remembered.
yeah.
You can check it out.
Yeah, it's the flat, well, it's the Keats Museum and the flats are next to the Spanish Steps.
Okay,
It's a
yeah.
fantastic location, a great place to stay.
Yeah.
It's a landmark trust.
And I think it's, yeah, it is, and I'm pretty sure you're right.
Yeah.
There's a death mask in there. Yeah.
Okay, yeah. So I do think probably the London one is a life one, because I think we have that here basically. So probably is, but you have to go back and check because I'm not too sure. Yeah, sorry.
Again, his education then, so
Yeah.
the fact that his father died when he was at what, 8,
Eight,
he
yeah.
said, and then his mum when he would have been 12 or 13 perhaps. I'm not quite sure.
Yes.
His mother died. Oh, sorry, his father died first, then his mother.
Yeah.
What education did he receive?
A very good one, actually, if not excellent. So he went to a school called Clark's Academy with his brother George. I think they boarded there, they lived there rather than at home. And he's really good friends with the headmaster's son, and the headmaster's son's actually the guy that introduces him to Leigh Hunt to begin with. And Clark's Academy is kind of like a radical school. So he's learning Latin, he's learning, maths, he's learning everything he needs to learn, basically, getting a very decent education because they could afford it. I think initially the parents, I think especially his mother, kind of were thinking of sending him to Harrow. So you can kind of see how well they're doing. They don't do that in the end. But there we go. So he's at Clark's Academy for about, I think, 10 years. I'd have to double check that one, and then he goes kind of straight into his apprenticeship as an apothecary. So he has a very good education for the time.
What's Clark's Academy?
Destiny. I'm going to go with Enfield.
Okay.
Yeah, because that's where he was living at the time.
Right.
I would have to that might be completely wrong because you know what, I never looked up where it was, so that's on me. At the back there.
Yeah, just as a heads up, you can occasionally visit the house in Edmonton Church Street. I think it was last year or the year before it was open for open house on a couple of days. It's privately owned, and the owners have kept it in very good condition.
That's great.
But it's fantastic to visit because it's in an area that isn't great. But
Yes.
It's a little bit of a going back to the past. So
Yeah,
well worth keeping your eye on. Whether it's open this year, I don't know.
Yeah, I had no idea they would do that for open house. That sounds great. I would say the Clark's Academy, you can't visit that because it got knocked down, and now there's a train station where it used to be, basically. So it's just a plaque to see now, which is a shame. Yeah, go for it.
Sorry, one more question. You said something about a heritage, an inheritance.
Yes.
What happened there?
Wait, that gets all a bit complicated. Hence me skipping that. Basically, what happens is the parents, let me think. So his dad dies, his granddad dies, and his granddad, John Jennings, was basically, he had a load of money and he left it kind of in trust, kind of. But then when his mother died as well, the siblings kind of came in charge of someone to look after them.
Financial management.
Kind of, yeah, like a guardian, basically. His last name was Abbey, and he doesn't seem to get on very well with John Keats. And he also doesn't seem to appreciate how large of a financial sum would have been available to John Keats and his siblings. So at that point, those siblings are actually starting to suffer because they don't have any money, but they actually do have a lot of money, they just don't know about it. So he never gets told that all this is for him, so he never claims it, basically. John Keats doesn't seem to be fantastic with money. He's very conscious of money, but not of how to spend it. He knows that there is some sort of inheritance waiting for him, but because he doesn't know the sum, he kind of takes credit against that inheritance, even though he doesn't know how large a sum it is. So he's constantly in financial straits, and his brother's always trying to borrow money from him, and everyone's suffering, even though it's very needless, and it's probably that guardian, Abby's, fault for not doing his job properly. He didn't need to suffer that much, especially with that much illness in a family. Having that money would have really helped them.
Yeah.
So it's a real shame.
It must have been very common because Wordsworth too had the same issues.
Yes. I mean, how would you find out?
Yeah.
Like, who do you ask?
Just people not acting on your behalf.
Yeah, because now I'd just be like, oh, Google what I have to do. But back then I wouldn't know where to begin if I didn't have my laptop. So I wouldn't know who to ask. It looks like what's happened with the Keats family, which is a shame. Yeah, the back there.
When were his poems published? And obviously he had his critics, very severe critics, but were they generally popular, if you can measure that somewhere?
I think because of the group he's in, they must have been fairly popular, because he's in that group with Shelley and all these Haydn and all these artists who are doing very well for themselves. I think he did quite decently. He's managing to publish lots of poetry, well, at the time he was alive, so he's doing all right. I think there was some problem with his publisher at some point where he didn't think he was getting like enough attention for his work. So maybe he's not as popular as he wants to be, but I think he's doing decently well. He's managing not to go back to medicine, so I think it's good enough for him. Any more?
Did his friends club together to pay his fare to Rome?
Ooh.
Or, I mean, you know, that would have been quite an undertaking.
I think I did read that answer somewhere, and it's just gone, I'm afraid. I'm not sure, does anyone know? I suppose that is rather my job to answer that one. I'm not too sure, to be honest. I suppose he was paying rent at Wentworth House, so he wasn't there for free. He was paying some amount per month. So he must have had money coming from somewhere, from his books, made from his books, from his poetry. So maybe he did fund it himself. But it's possible that his friends did band together.
Yeah, there was a film, Bright Star,
yeah, there was.
a few years ago, and that, I got that idea from that film, I think.
We'll go with a possibly. Yeah. I'll have to look it up after. I'm not 100% on that one. As soon as he's heading off to Rome, it's kind of where I ended it. Anyone? Oh, sorry, online. My apologies.
Yeah, so one of the questions online I think we've already answered. So what happened to Fanny B after Keats' death?
Yeah, we did answer that one, yeah.
And another person has asked 2 questions, which I'm just going to read out.
Yeah, go for it.
So was the Keats family wealth earned from chattel slavery in British America? And is this documented in the Keats House archives?
I cannot answer that because I don't know.
It's
a difficult question, so I think your best bet, if you're really interested in that kind of thing, if you contact Keats House, there's a man that works there called Ken Page who knows literally everything about Keats, and he'd be in a great position to try and answer that one. But given the seriousness of that question, I would not want to attempt to answer that without knowing a lot more. Sorry.
Thank you. I will put that in.
Yeah, go for it.
Okay. As you mentioned, besides Keats House, where you get this archive manuscript?
Oh, okay. So, are you asking where we keep the documents, basically?
Yeah.
Okay. So, So, some of the documents I showed today. So, like this map here, the parish this document here, the parish registers. They all belong to the London Archives, and we own them. But documents such as, let me see. I can find one. So, such as this apothecary certificate, these notebooks, everything, kind of this as well, everything Keats related does still belong to Keats House, and some of it is on display over there, but the bulk of their archives and their libraries is actually stored here. So we look after it for them because we're all City of London here, basically. So we're all funded by the City of London, and that's kind of how they come to be here. If you're interested in viewing the archive, I'd recommend contacting Keats House first, because they'll be able to help you. They know a lot more about their collections than we would, basically. Yeah, all right. There's also a lot of documents at City of Westminster Archives. So, so the records of Guy's Hospital and that kind of thing are there, and the St George's Hanover Square parish registers for the marriage of his parents are also at that archive too. So it's in Westminster, so sadly we don't have it. I'm very jealous. Any more? No? None online? Well, that's fantastic then.